The Manhunt for Dan Dd Cooper by Connor Krenzer, Jack Palumbo, Dante Albanese, Logan Schaff, Christian Francis, and Arthur Morrison. The greatest criminals are the ones who never get caught. On November 24th, 1971, Dd Cooper left a legacy as the man who hijacked a plane and got away without a trace. The name was inspired by a French comic titled Dan Cooper, which was never translated into English, oddly enough. In the comic, Dan Cooper was a test pilot in the Canadian Air Force. In the real world, Dan Cooper was a notorious criminal. If there was ever a real-world foil to James Bond, it would have to be him. In the afternoon of Thanksgiving Eve, a man dressed in a suit with an attaché case boarded a Northwest Orient Airlines Boeing 727 at Portland International Airport. The name on his ticket read Dan Cooper, and he was on a one-way trip to Seattle. Mr. Cooper settled himself down in the rear of the passenger cabin. He lit a cigarette, ordered some bourbon, and waited for the flight to commence. After takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant, who shrugged it off as a businessman giving her his number. She ignored it, but he insisted she have a look, as he had stuck a bomb onto the plane in his briefcase. The passengers were unaware of the hijacking and had been told that their plane was experiencing mechanical issues and would have a delayed landing while Cooper's demand was being met. Upon arrival at the Seattle airport, all crew and passengers except a pilot were evacuated, and $200,000 worth $1.2 million by today's standards, and ransom money along with some parachutes were given to him. The jet was then refueled, although it did not have a large enough tank to get him to Mexico, meaning he would have to refuel again stateside. Cooper must have expected the jump from the plane because he ordered the pilot to fly with an unpressurized cabin at low altitude. Two fighter jets tailed the 727 in blind spots both above and below the craft as it left Seattle. No one inside could see them. Sometime mid-flight, after the second takeoff, the aft stairs opened, and Cooper jumped out over the lower Cascade Mountains on a dark and stormy night. The legend of Dd Cooper ends right there. He was never to be seen or heard from with certainty again.
Go.
When he got on a plane in Portland, Oregon last night, he was just another passenger who gave his name as D.A. Cooper. But today, after hijacking a Northwest Airlines jet, ransoming the passengers in Seattle, then making a getaway by parachute somewhere between there and Reno, Nevada, the description on one wire service, master criminal. Bill Curtis reports.
36 passengers got off the jetliner in Seattle last night, left aboard 4 crew members and the hijacker, dressed in a business suit demanding $200,000 and carrying a plain briefcase which he told the crew held explosives. With the full ransom collected from Seattle banks and 4 parachutes aboard, the plane headed for Reno. It took 3.5 hours, slow for a jet, but the hijacker had given detailed flight instructions. The rear stairwell was open all the way. It arrived at Reno in shreds. The crew, here being debriefed by the FBI, was told to fly low over Oregon's flatlands with the flaps down. The speed dropped to 200 miles per hour. Somewhere, the hijacker parachuted away with the money. The crew had little to say.
We gave the information to the authorities, and we just don't want to discuss it any further.
Have you been told by the FBI not to discuss?
No, they handle their investigation, and my company would rather have it released through them.
Tina, were you with the rest of the crew during the flight after you left the ground the last time?
Yes, I went up to the cockpit.
None of you were within sight of the hijacker, right?
Right. We already talked about it, and the captain,
How did you surmise that he was not on the plane when he landed in Reno?
Well, a search was made of the plane immediately after landing.
As we understood it, he could have gotten off as the plane taxied before it came up here. How did the crew know he wasn't on when it touched ground?
The crew couldn't know that, but we had the airport covered.
Are the authorities now searching for the...
Snow covers the mountains in Northern California and Nevada, a hostile terrain for any parachute drop, especially at night. Police believe he left the 727 in the flatlands of Oregon or Washington, but they are still looking in 4 states, even around the airport. Authorities began their search here, thinking the hijacker may have jumped off at the end of the runway as the plane touched down. But the problem is more complex. A daring parachute escape from a flying 727 somewhere between Reno and Seattle, Washington. Bill Curtis, CBS News, Reno.
When the pilot landed, he was greeted by SWAT teams. They searched the plane, but Cooper had been gone along with the money and a parachute. Witnesses were interviewed immediately after getting to safety, and police sketches had been drawn. The hunt was on. The military had been called in, and a 1,000-man team searched the area Cooper was believed to have landed. It was thought he left no trace until a boy found some $20 bills with serial numbers that matched those he was given when the jet was refueling. That was the FBI's biggest lead, but it couldn't answer any questions. Only pose more. There was never a trial for the hijacking, but many suspects did come out over time. Among these were workers for the airline, ex-military personnel, Boeing employees, and people with aliases who were in the area. Duane Weber told his wife on his deathbed that he was Dan Cooper. His wife even discovered that he went by another name, John C. Collins, and had been checked into the Portland Airport Motel the night before the jet's hijacking. He even smoked and drank bourbon like Cooper had on the plane. Another suspect worth noting is Sheridan Peterson, who was a Boeing employee. He was known to some as Dan and had been a founding member of the Boeing Employees Skydiving Club, where he worked as a technical editor in the 60s. As a technical editor of the company, he would have had advanced knowledge of the capabilities of the 727. Add on to that the fact that he was an experienced skydiver and even jumped out of a plane in a suit and a 50-pound sack of flour. His story cannot be ignored. Military personnel made up a large portion of the suspect list. Among them were Ted Braden and Robert Rackstraw. The former was a member of a special operations group whose superiors believed he went rogue. His whereabouts immediately after the hijacking are unknown. Robert Rackstraw is another ex-military suspect. He attended aviation and jump schools, which makes him a likely culprit, and he was good at what he did. A man with contempt for others around him, he was known to be a troublemaker. A dangerous combination of maliciousness and skill, he made his way up to the rank of first lieutenant in the Army. During his time in the Army, he had been caught stealing from his superiors, he killed an elephant for seemingly no reason, and eventually led the FBI to be highly suspicious of him. Whoever it may be, we may never know. All we can do is speculate. A letter sent to the FBI in 1971 was alleged to be from Dan Cooper himself. It contained a potential motive. He admitted that he was frustrated with his life and had only 14 months to live. Claiming he was no modern-day Robin Hood, it can be attributed he wanted to live the remainder of his life in peace. Based on the letter suspected to be from Dd Cooper himself, it can be assumed he was influenced by instincts and thus, based on Freud's ideas, consumed with the needs that id generally has. The id feels that it must have what it wants. In Cooper's case, his sudden desire to live out his life peacefully influenced his decision to hijack the plane in order to ransom money. The hijacking and escape were both meticulously calculated and planned. Thus, his actions were not purely based on impulse. If they had been, he most probably would not have devised an elaborate escape plan. Cooper had some form of reason within his mind. He was aware of the consequences, yet he still hijacked the plane. He had selfish tendencies not completely controlled by his instinctual desires, instilled by the id. Based on Kohlberg's ideas of moral development, Cooper was in the second stage within the first level, in which the interests of the self are the individual's top priority. Given his time limit, Cooper was greatly interested in acquiring enough money to live out his life in peace, and was not directly concerned with the consequences. Cooper's mind is dominated by the id, but has a developed ego to prevent impulsivity, which is why he had a plan of escape. Cooper must have had an underdeveloped superego with no influence on his decision-making, decisions that the ego regulated, but are ultimately controlled by the id. Furthermore, due to his low progression on moral development, he was more interested in improving himself rather than following a moral code instilled by society. A new draft of flight legislations came soaring into view following the Cooper case. In the years after the 1971 incident, 19 hijackings were carried out with the specific purpose of extorting money, while most of the rest were attempts to reach Cuba. In a sense, Dan Cooper started a trend for criminals in the Reno area, which kept local law enforcement agencies on their toes. Some of the new modifications made to the larger aircraft included devices which would keep passengers safe, as well as preventing another Cooper case. In early 1973, the FAA began requiring airlines to search all passengers and their bags. The reasoning behind this was to prevent any weapons, explosives in particular, from being brought onto commercial aircraft. The Cooper case marked an era of multiple copycat hijackings, which led to several new modifications to the aircraft. The 727 was legally required to lock aft stairs while the plane is in flight. This became known as the Cooper vane. One of the last modifications that were made to these aircrafts also include the installation of peepholes into all cockpit doors. This made it possible for the cockpit crew to observe people in the passenger cabin without having to open the cockpit door.
Finally, it's one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in U.S. history, the 1971 Dd Cooper hijacking, when a man jumped out of a plane with a parachute and a bag of ransom money and vanished. Now, 45 years later, the FBI is closing the case because of a lack of credible leads. Our Cynthia McFadden has more on the mystery still baffling investigators.
45 years ago, Dd Cooper bailed out of a 727 with $200,000 strapped to his chest. It led to hundreds of news reports.
He parachuted out of the plane. It landed in Reno, and he hasn't been seen since.
Inspiring a 1981 movie and dozens of armchair detectives. What the case has not had is a resolution. Despite the FBI's pursuing thousands of leads and nearly as many suspects, the hijacker's true identity was never uncovered. And now he's not likely to be, the FBI officially ending what it called one of its longest and most exhaustive investigations. It was the day before Thanksgiving in 1971. A man in a suit and tie identified himself as Dan Cooper. He passed a note to a flight attendant claiming he had a bomb. The plane landed in Seattle, where he exchanged the passengers for that $200,000 and 4 parachutes.
You saw the exchange of money? We saw them bring the money aboard.
He then demanded to be flown to Mexico. 45 minutes later, the rear door opened and he jumped 10,000 feet into a rainstorm, hurling himself into history as the perpetrator of America's only unsolved hijacking.
He was not nervous. He seemed rather nice, and other than he wanted certain things to be done.
Ralph Himmelsbach was the FBI's point man on the case for years.
I think of him as being just another sleazy, rotten criminal.
But the one who got away. Cynthia McFadden, NBC News, New York.
Hey, NBC.